I'm Mike Dunn. I'm with Colin Powell and Herissier, and we're in, very significantly, Cyril Le Marchand House. Now, just to create the illusion of, we're all about the same age here. I've got an assistant here who's not going to be speaking, but she's here just to nudge me. But we're all, the four of us, are all about the same age. And I came to Jersey in 1966 to work for an architect. My salary, my pay was £15 a week. I rented a little bed sit at £4 a week. I ran a motor car. A bottle of brown ale was a shilling. I could fly to Bristol for £5. I could go to any travel agent and book a ticket. And if I wanted to change it, it was generally no problem to change a ticket. What I'm saying is life was much easier then. So, Colin, you came a few years after that, 1969. I've been doing my swatting. You were recruited. Who recruited you?
The States of Jersey recruited me. The establishment committee of the day were persuaded by Hugh Thurston, who did a report on the common market and
right.
the prospect of the UK going into the common market and what its effect would be on Jersey. And he said he had to try and get together a lot of information to show how the economy would be affected. And he was conscious of the fact that there wasn't very much information available. So he suggested that he did as best he could and did a very good job of it, but he suggested that they should have an economic advisor to actually do as one of his first tasks an economic survey of Jersey. And so with some reluctance on the part of some politicians, they decided that they needed an economist.
Right.
And this was a job was offered, and I was fortunate enough to get it.
Because that book you produced was a remarkable bit of research, and if you only did it in 2 years.
That's right, yes. I mean, that was the idea, was that to get something out as soon as possible so that we knew what was making the economy tick and what we should be looking at in terms of reaction to not only just the common market, but what else was happening around the world.
Because it's sort of tied in, because they had the Barrett plan, so there's the Island plan. They were sort of thinking in rather broader principles, because this is one of the elements. I can't get any grasp on the politics of the people involved in the States before the 60s. I don't know what they're about. I can't understand. Like Cyril Le Marchand, this building is named after him, but I can't really grasp what it was. He suddenly popped out one day and said, look, we've got £9 million income tax. We've got to run this as a proper business. We've got to get organised. That was roughly, apparently, what he said. And that seemed to sum up their attitude then. The politicians weren't very sophisticated, were they, Roy? Did you meet many of them?
No, I didn't meet many. I did meet Cyril Le Marchand. I met Senator Rumford. And everybody, in a way, in education met Senator John Le Marchand, who was, of course, president. And then, if you applied for a grant, a university grant, you often got interviewed personally by him. I mean,
right.
That's how the system used to run in those days. I'm not sure I totally agree with you. It was the era, and you get many letters of nostalgia in the JP attesting to this. It was the era when a group of business people, and it was largely businessmen, but not exclusively, when a group of business people inherited government, so to speak. There'd been this victory of the Jersey Progressive Party in about, I think, the 1948 elections after the last great reforms, and they looked to be very much the last great reforms. They took power. They routed the JDM. There was only one member who was called Venables, Stephen Venables, who was a tax consultant, I understand, by profession, which was ironical. They routed them, particularly in the countryside. So it set a trend with which we've obviously become very familiar. And they rode the wave of the growth of mass tourism. They rode the wave of agriculture still being very successful and becoming more and more diversified until it hit the buffers when European competition, and Colin can talk about this, when European competition came along and those markets were open.
Of course, tourism then was helped because of the dollar premium on money, the sterling area restriction.
Well, yeah, some of the sterling area was there, then people couldn't take money out of the country, and so the island was very attractive because of that. And it was before the kind of days of mass tourism down to Spain and the like. But I mean, I think that picking up your question about what was the politicians doing before the 1960s. I mean, I think they were managing the budgets. That they were very much alive to social needs. I mean, a good example of that, and I think that the one that really stamps out, the real quality of Cyril Lamarck was the way he weighed in support of the proposal to introduce social security contributions.
Right.
Philip Lefevre was brought that forward. Cyril Lamarck supported him wholeheartedly. The farmers were totally against it. They, to the extent that they withdrew their business from the Marcon brothers, the seed merchants.
Really?
And but Cyril Lamarck was not dissuaded by the fact that he'd lost all that business. He carried on, supported it, got it through. We got social security contributions and social security benefits through as a result of his and others' commitment to that. I mean, the good thing about it was that after a very short time after it was all passed and everything else, the farmers realised that the Marcon brothers was actually the best business to go to get their stuff, so they all came back. But no, I mean that was a good indication of just he was a man who did see the future and was committed to his island and to the social welfare of those resident in it.
Yeah, I think Colin's put his finger on it. The Social Security is a fascinating episode, but in a way it was a signal that the old order was dying. Even though the farmers were very strident and there were things like coffins carried in the Royal Square, it all got very
parish
aggressive.
relief hung on for a long time afterwards, didn't it?
sorry?
The welfare grant, yes. I mean, the parish relief, that was well into the 1970s. Where we had the Working Party on Need, which I worked with Cyril Lamarck, and we worked to try and get some coordination between the parishes, because there was under that system, whether you got any welfare at all depended on the constable of each parish.
Right. The business about the anti-usury law, which is generally given as the sort of starting point for the finance industry. It wasn't, in fact, as we know it. There was finance was going on here before the Winston Churchill Chancellor of the Exchequer in the 1920s.
Yes,
it was all that imperial contribution. There was lots of discussions about it.
Yeah.
And I've got some books in front of me showing about the smuggling that used to go on for centuries. So it's nothing. This use of the constitutional relationship is nothing new. That's my hobby horse. But Cyril got onto this, the realisation that you had to abolish this Usury Act, which limited.
It limited the rate of interest you could charge on loans. So if the States was issuing a loan because it wanted to raise money to spend on sewers and the like, and it was trying to attract money from the public, if it was faced with the Code of 1771's 5% usury limit, then that placed a restriction on his ability to raise money.
But didn't the public have a bit of an out? Because I remember I went to look to buy my father's cottage in the 70s. The interest then the bank wanted was 20%, and I couldn't afford to pay 20%. Wouldn't the general public say, well, we want it kept to 5%?
No, the 70s are a different period altogether, because that was reflecting of the oil crisis and inflation rates going up through the roof, which is why the interest rates were so high. No, the interest rates were not that much higher than the 5% at that time.
Right.
We were talking about 6 or 7% perhaps. There was people wanted to borrow money, and if the banks were not prepared to lend, because they couldn't charge that rate, they would send the money out. Then that would be to the disadvantage of the borrowers as well. So there wasn't any real strong public reaction at the time. No. The states rejected the idea first time round, sent it back, said that perhaps there's an alternative way of dealing with it, and when it came back, the actual regulations provided for a 2-year review, but events then moved on, and the whole thing settled down very quickly.
Of course, the 1771, again, is one of my hobby horses, because the 1771 code derives from the 1769 mini Jersey Revolution, and that was they wanted a book of words to tell them what the laws were. I mean, it's a pretty thin volume, as we can see there, so it didn't tell them a lot. But it had a significance as far as change of the governmental system was, taking it away from the royal court, which process still continues today. And this is one of the fascinating aspects of this. We've now got a chief executive officer, Charlie Parker, they call him. They don't seem to mind calling him Charlie. who's obviously undertaking reforms which have been trying to be undertaken for a very long time, haven't they? I mean, when you arrived, in a way, you were a sort of a quiet Charlie, weren't you? Because you were there to look at the whole thing. I mean, you had to look at the whole economic setup, which is what he's having to do. But he's got powers to do things, doesn't he? Presumably, you didn't have powers to do
No, we
anything.
didn't. We had to do everything by persuasion.
Right.
And I think things did change, and things were improved quite significantly. I think there was much more recognition and realisation of what was the island was all about in terms of its economy, and if you wanted to improve the standard of living of island residents, what you had to do. And so there was and of course the island was favoured then with a period of business growth, which meant they had better revenues, better budgets, and able to spend much more money on public services. So the whole situation did change significantly.
How do you plan for something which is constantly changing? Like the economy is constantly growing.
Yeah.
So you've got more and more money. There's more and more things you can do. How on earth do you decide, as a government, what you should do? How do you decide that?
Well, I mean, I think there are a number of factors which influence you in that respect. I mean, one is that there's never a lack of proposals on the table to spend money.
Right.
How much money you spend depends on the view you take about what the future might hold and the extent to which you want reserves against the prospect of things not being quite so rosy in the future. So that's what we did in the 1980s when the money was coming in, and I think that Senator Vibert at the time said money was coming out of our ears.
Sure.
And Senator Jean, who then was Finance and Economics Committee President, and I were talking about this, and it was felt that what we should do is build up a strategic reserve. And so rather than spend the money, notwithstanding that there were lots of projects on the table, we put a significant amount into the strategic reserve, which is still there.
Still there, right.
Ready for the rainy day.
Not for much longer, I don't think.
Well, anyway, so I mean, I think that there was that need to look at it. But I think the other reaction to your question is that we've taken the view over the years in advising government was that government should be there to facilitate. It should create a favourable environment for business. It shouldn't attempt to determine what business should be there or what it should do. I mean, it's the old classics situation. If you've got a shipbuilding industry which is declining, the government's are tempted to try and prop it up, whereas it's just not going to happen.
Which is a dilemma for farming now because it is in decline, and
so
the best use of land may not be farming. That's my view. Roy, you did an interesting paper. For some reason, you found yourself in Hong Kong. I don't know what it was all about, but you wrote an interesting paper there about the transference from British. But they had the agreement, the lease.
Yeah, the Chinese rule.
The civil administration. I see this as the same battle. This trying to get government in the control of people who were answerable to the public. So this sort of strange, and you were anticipating the same problem, weren't you? Because obviously you were trying to, as far as I understood your paper, trying to set up a civil administration, knowing that there would be politicians who wouldn't necessarily be popular or whatever, or their views weren't to be.
It was slightly different than that. Basically, there was a feeling for a long time in Hong Kong that the civil service were the dominant power.
Right.
There was a very weak legislature.
Right.
It was chosen in a very strange way, like there were lawyer seats,
Right.
there were business people seats, it was a sectoral interest group kind of legislature, as if they were afraid to have open elections.
But you wouldn't say this is why I'm thinking
the civil service.
You wouldn't say it was comparable with Jersey, because obviously the interests of the Jersey government was very much along those lines.
The civil service was very much in charge, and this was always the debate,
Right.
And it was meant, and it was seen as a benign sort of affair. In other words, they basically bought into the free trade model, which was obviously Hong Kong.
Because this battle that's going on now, they've got this. Ostensibly, it was brought in because the Jersey way has to change. That was the report of the Independent Care Inquiry. That's one of the things, and Senator Gorse, when he was Chief Minister, was saying he's going to undertake that work, he's going to change the system. And as I understood it, Charlie Parker was brought in to change the system. Now, You were on Clothier.
Yes.
That was what was it they called it? The mechanism. What did they call it? The
Machinery of government.
Machinery of government. But it didn't change it, did it? It didn't substantially change the machinery of government. Now, there have been lots of them that have been nibbling away at such things. Can an individual like Mr. Parker or anybody do what that is needed to be done? Can it happen?
Well, I think, yes, I think it can eventually happen. I mean, it's interesting when those of us who were on Clothier recognised that it was going to be difficult to get all the proposals accepted. We hoped that they wouldn't cherry pick, but in the event they did cherry pick. But I remember one of the members of the Clothier panel, who was a Don from Oxford, saying that he'd had a similar situation with Oxford University, where he had tried to make the kind of changes, and he reckoned that it took at least kind of 2 bites at the cherry. You know, you kind of put up your proposals, they tended to be implemented a bit, but not everything, and people reacted, and then maybe 5-10 years later, people began to think, well, maybe they were quite good ideas after all, and they kind of came in. It's taken a lot longer, perhaps, in the case of Clothier and where we are today. But I think change does come about eventually if the mood is right for it.
When you went into the States, Roy, what, 1999? 1999. Were you salaried then? Was that paid?
No, it was still means tested.
It was still means tested,
yes,
wasn't it?
yeah.
Because obviously that was a radical change,
yes,
making money available for states members. That should have had a huge impact. It has had a large impact, but not as much as I thought it would.
Can I jump in there?
Yeah,
because while it's easy to feel depressed about Clothier, because obviously the deficiencies or the lack of action was on the representative side of government, that we couldn't get the changes through. I was the first person, because I almost by default, because the then Senator Lakeman had resigned from PPC, so we had there'd been a long period when nothing much had happened and the public were getting very anxious, and I knew the so-called executive side of government were getting anxious, so we brought all the representative proposals forward and we got totally slaughtered. And it's incrementally made a bit of progress since then, but essentially we got slaughtered. But the moves towards executive government did continue, and of course they've now materialised in the sense of a council of ministers. The glue that is not there to hold the system together or to allow the backbenchers, other than through scrutiny, to be a real counterbalance is, of course, the lack of a party system. The glue could be the party system. Clothier mentioned this, but they said there will only be a party system if the people want it. You cannot artificially impose one upon people.
I mean, I think one of the aspects of Clothier which was taken on board, but wasn't applied as Clothier envisaged it, was very much the scrutiny system.
Yes.
The initial action on the part of the politicians was that to obviously form the ministers as being those who they thought were most capable of running the ministries, and then the ministers appointed their assistant ministers, and they appointed all their assistant ministers, all the people that they thought were also fairly capable, and then people, kind of what was left.
Yes, the second 11
was for scrutiny. Whereas what Clothier had in mind was that the scrutiny teams should be led by people who would become ministers, and therefore were really capable people and would really kind of strike a balance. Now that's happening, but it didn't happen initially, and I think that was unfortunate.
Yes,
but I think that these things are evolutionary. I don't think you can expect things to happen.
Well, I'm a bit of a scrutiny addict. I think I've been to more scrutiny meetings than anybody ever for my crimes. And I must say they seem to be getting weaker. They do seem to be. They're not challenging. They're not challenging. And obviously I would like to see more challenging of whatever the proposal is, or not out of spite, because a lot of questions need to be asked. They've now got I went to the scrutiny this week and they had a couple of lay members on there, one of whom was extremely good, very articulate, asking lots of questions, and that if that progresses, in other words, calling people from outside the system, that was an excellent mood. But of course they're not accountable to the public, so if they start moving things, I don't know what.
I'm surprised you say that you think it's getting weaker. I think that in terms of the membership and the people involved, I think I get the feeling, and certainly to the extent I've been involved with them, I think they're getting stronger. I mean, people like Christina Moore is now involved much more on the scrutiny side. Kirsten Morell, people like that, and I think there's some good signs there.
Yeah, I would. Oddly enough, I would agree with Colin on that one. I think we've got some new members. We've got some very enthusiastic members. I mean, the problem is there's not a growing. Sorry, there's not a way. If there were like the kind of routes you get in the UK, where you often start in local government, you work through their systems, sometimes committee, but increasingly executive systems. By the time you come to national politics, if you've followed that route, although a lot do come through these so-called research departments, which makes me very worried. If you followed that route, you're quite well versed in politics. You know the ins and outs of politics.
Of course,
and as a local councillor, you will have dealt with, for good or for bad, with the nitty-gritty of issues.
In Jersey, the tradition is more to come up through the honorary system rather than the political system. I mean, it's training. You're speaking in public. You're meeting. You're dealing with problems.
I think that is now fast declining.
Do you think so?
That you come up through the honour. You certainly, the country still holds a lot of sway over the system. Of that, there's no doubt. But the idea that you were chosen from the parishes great and good, you know, who'd been, I don't know, a centennial.
The country is one aspect I want to discuss. I know I've got dozens of aspects I want to. If you've got 3 hours, we can fill through.
Not that long. So,
do you?
I don't think the listeners have either.
First, because
can it survive? Can it survive with this much too weight coming from the country parishes? Can the system survive? I mean, obviously the constables is the element, but it's not only that. It's the representation, the keeping the countryside green. Obviously it's desirable, but you're an economist. Is that economically sound, keeping the countryside green? I mean, I wish you'd done one every 10 years, one of those reports.
Well, I wrote an annual report on the budget every year, which kind of tended to bring it up to date. I don't see any problem about keeping the countryside green.
You don't?
No. I don't see it as a problem. I'm not quite sure what you do with the countryside otherwise than keeping it green.
Well, no, it is a problem, but obviously building on it is one thing. But environmentally, farming is becoming more and more doubtful from an environmental point of view. And we just had a United Nations report came out, which we're all going to drown in 10 years, I think. So, you know, I mean, I don't know what we can do about that in Little Jersey, but it has to be taken on board, doesn't it? If all these factors which cause pollution and so on have to be borne in mind.
I think the bigger, Colin, the bigger issue, Michael, and of course it's another one of these perennial issues that comes up at every election, and a great sort of righteous indignation is expressed, and then not a lot happens, is of course this issue, I'm afraid, of population.
Yeah.
And the more the population grows, obviously, the more infrastructure you have to provide, and the more incursions on the countryside.
Right.
But it's very hard, even, I think Colin's right in the sense that countryside here is a tremendous amenity feature of the island.
Absolutely.
It is.
And people, they may not be able to give you a figure for it in hard economic terms. And you may be able to argue, for example, that cows on green fields, as you do argue, are an incredible waste of resources, as well as adding to the methane gas sort of problem.
I mean, those are relatively small. It's just the idea that they're there to attract tourists. That is it's an expensive way to attract tourists.
No, I think it's to provide a breathing space for people.
It's more than... I mean, I think you have to look at it from a number of angles. One is it does have a beneficial effect for the tourism industry. Undoubtedly, we are attracting much more what we call environmental tourism. Certainly the kind of Germans and Scandinavians come and they're walking around the country, and it certainly makes Jersey much more attractive than its opposite number in Guernsey in that respect. So I think there is a factor there, and I've always been a firm supporter of tourism, as we did in the 1970s, and I've always said when people talk about, oh, isn't it a shame we haven't diversified the economy? We have a diversified economy. We have tourism, and we are perhaps not doing enough to support tourism in that respect. But I think the other factor is that, which is very much reflected in the policy regarding milk. This is why you've got cows on the fields, not because it's attractive for tourists who like to take pictures of them, that is that we are an island, we are vulnerable, we can be cut off, and in the same way that we need to have an electricity power station sitting there which is capable of producing all of our electricity, if the French pulled the plug, so if the kind of transport system broke down, the only way of supplying the island with milk is from within the island. We have to have that security. And I think it's important to keep the countryside green, so that it's a bit like, you might say, almost like the kind of wartime scenario in the UK. And that is that if it comes to it, you've got green fields, you can plough them up. And
every patch of ground you grow something
you grow something. If you build on them all,
I understand. I understand fully.
You've lost it. So it's a long-term security and also a short-term benefit.
But somebody's got to pay for it in the meantime to keep it going.
That's inevitably the case. But if it's a benefit to the community at large, then it's worth doing. Because
you've got to get away. Well, one final question, a subject we haven't discussed. You used to be involved with a thing called the Care Trust.
Jersey Childcare Trust.
I never quite understood what its role was, but one year you put out a very critical report about lack of resources, I think it was. I forget now, but it struck me as being, that's the sort of voice I want, because I'm that sort of person. I want to hear critical observations, people who understand the system. And you put out a report which was excellent. Did you take any part in the inquiry, the abuse inquiry that took place?
No.
Did you have any knowledge? Did you know anything?
I knew the inquiry was going on.
Yeah, but did you know about the stuff they were talking about?
I did have an indirect impact, in the sense that I was chairman of the Jersey Childcare Trust for 10 years, but then under the state's system you only can stay for 10 years as chairman of one of these bodies. So I had to retire from that. But while I was at the Jersey Childcare Trust, I was taking the view that preschool education was terribly important. In other words, get to children young, even from the day they're born.
Right.
In other words, that investing in children up to the age of 3 makes a tremendous difference to how they are when they get to 5, when they get to 10, or when they get to 15. So we were very concerned that not enough resources were going into that kind of early years education.
Right.
Subsequently, and I'm still involved, I'm very much involved with the NSPCC fundraising, but also kind of generally pushing for the contribution that the NSPCC can also make to, and did make to early years development. And again, the same message from the NSPCC is that get to the children young, and that you get real benefits in later years, right the way through to teenage plus teenage, and social adaptability and acceptability. So I'm still pressing that, and so that was something that I think is taken on board by the child abuse inquiry, but obviously they were much more concerned about the whole question of abuse.
Do you have
the
any?
NSPCC is very much involved.
Do you have any thoughts about the inquiry, the way it's panning out, the way they're implementing or not implementing? Do you have any thoughts?
No, I mean, I think the politicians now recognise that the implementation is not moving forward as fast as it should do, and I think Deputy Mezek, Senator Mezek rather, recognises that he's perhaps got a year in which he's got to actually deliver on some of these things. So it is important that there is delivery. The NSPCC is doing its bit. It's got a Let the Future In service, which is providing a counselling service to those aged 4 to 17 who have been the victims of abuse. So there's a contribution being made by the private sector as well, or the non-public sector.
One of the problems is, of course, finding people to do the job. And you came in 1969. You're still here, remarkably, doing a job. I don't know exactly what it is, but you're still in office. You've still got your office here now.
Yeah.
I mean, people don't do that, do they? They don't stay that long.
No, they don't. No. I'm primarily, my job is advising on international affairs, but I'm also holding on to my office here because all the information is in here, and I'm writing my second book.
Oh, good.
Which is
we've been waiting for the second book since 1972.
I know.
Are they your memoirs?
No,
we're looking for that.
This is the history of Jersey, or the history of Jersey's development as an international. That's
right. You have mentioned that before, and I sort of nudge you whenever I see you.
Getting more time to work on it. So
I've been writing my book for 40 years, I warn you. How about you, Roy? Where's your second book coming out?
Well, maybe the spirit is willing, but the flesh sometimes.
You do publish good little things.
Yeah, I like publishing little articles.
That little thing where you did on local industry, which Colin contributed.
Yes, he
made a comment.
very much so, because in a way that was reflective of the incredible role that Colin played in government, which you'd never get now with all this vast array of experts that we brought in. But essentially one person was behind the scenes. I won't say pulling the levers, or that would be the case.
Pulling the threads.
Pulling the threads. And it was remarkably run. So when you say, I mean, government then was much more straightforward than it is now. And I suppose what I would like to write, if I could get myself organised, is the change, because we're sort of stuck at the moment. You know, we're stuck between a move to an executive government. We've probably got too powerful an executive in the absence of political parties, for example. We've still got the whole country thing, which we haven't resolved, and the role of constables in the states. So we're stuck, basically, and I can see people's frustration. And I think the island is at a turning point. There's no doubt, and Colin would know this much more than I, finance is a much more complex matter. The way you handle it, the way you deal with the ethics of finance, much more complex matter. And we tend, the states, we tend to get sort of diverted to things like the St Mary's traffic improvements, wonderful though they may have been.
Ironic that Colin came in when they were talking about going into the European Union, and now you're here and it's going out. Just one, because I know you've got to get away. This building bears the name. I won't suggest you ought to have a monument, but your service.
No, I don't need a monument.
But this building, ironically, which Cyril Marcon fought against building at all,
he did, yes,
bears his name in very large Soviet-style letters.
Yes.
If it's demolished, his name will disappear. Should he have another monument? Do you think he should have a monument?
I don't think Cyril would ever have worried about whether he had a monument or not. He wasn't that kind of man. But I think he does need to be recognised. He was a giant amongst men in terms of the politics of the island for an awful long time. So I think it would be a shame if some people are recognised, you know, and his name goes on and his doesn't. I think there should be some. But of course, there's no reason why. I think given his social awareness and everything else, I think he might have been quite pleased with it. If this building is as vacated as it's going to be, and if it's going to be either knocked down or converted into residential accommodation, and there's going to be a block, there's no reason why it shouldn't be Cyril and Marcon House.
Right.
No reason at all. And I think on the basis, as you say, he didn't want this to be built. He probably turned in his grave when they named it after him. Yes. But I think the name could continue with a new development.
Thanks for that. Thanks very much, Roy.
Our pleasure. Thank you.